a chance to look at the Tribes on the Edge website? I'll just look over at your images and yes. Okay, we have quite a few yeses. So I'll just give a short introduction to what Tribes on the Edge is, and won't go into too much detail, but you can go to the website if you haven't had a chance to. It's tribesontheedge.com. There is a trailer there. It's about 1:40. It will give you an idea of what the project is and what it's about. But essentially, Tribes on the Edge is a documentary film and an impact campaign. And it is created as a result of the request of the tribes of an indigenous territory in the Brazilian Amazon. It's called the Vale do Chiavari. I see one person can't hear. Maybe you have to switch your settings. I'm not quite sure how to help you with that, Poonam. So Tribes on the Edge was started because the tribes wanted the world to know that they exist. And that is something that's really important. If we don't know about a problem, how can we help solve it? So their stories are quite difficult. They are not unique. There are stories like this all over the world, sadly, where outsiders have come in and wanted to take resources from the jungle or wanted to develop roads, and the tribes suffer as a result of that. So the basics of the story are that they're dealing with really high rates of hepatitis. They're confronting malaria, but there's also a desire from outsiders to come in and actually develop the territory because there's oil under their feet. So the government, for economic reasons, wants to drill under their land. Now, here's something that's really important for us all to acknowledge and to know, and to connect it back to climate change, but also to connect it to the global story. Indigenous tribes traditionally are the best guardians of these ecosystems. Because if you look at maps where there are indigenous people, and I've only been working in the Amazon, so I can only refer to that, but if you look at the Amazon and you look at where the indigenous territories are, you won't see any deforestation. Why? Because the indigenous tribes living there understand that if they want to survive, they need to live in balance with their environment. So they don't actually use more than they need. If they need to construct a canoe, they will cut a tree. But as I've learned from them, and I asked years ago, about 10 years ago when I was first there, I said, how do you live sustainably in your environment? And the answer didn't come right away, because I realized that there was no other way for them to live. When I asked this question of the chief, he said, I don't understand. And so I defined sustainability in the simplest way possible, which is living in balance and only using what you need. And he said, well, when I cut a tree, I plant one. And when I go hunting to feed my family, I don't take more than what my family needs. So I think what we've come to nowadays is this full circle idea. We've created a lot of terminology around what it means to live in balance, about what it means to live sustainably. But these tribes have always done that, and they still are doing it. Now, if we go back to of climate change, one of the big contributors to climate change is deforestation. Trees act as a carbon sequester. So if the trees are standing, they're doing us a service by essentially cleaning our air, to put it very simply. So if the trees are standing, that's a really good thing for all of us. And if the indigenous people are the guardians of that ecosystem, protecting them and their right to their ancestral land protects the rainforest. So that's the project I've been working on. The film itself, Tribes on the Edge, will talk a little bit about that. It will talk about the plight of the indigenous people and our relationship to them. But the important part, and I love this, is climate action. The important part is, what do we do? So the film will help inspire people and connect them to a story. But what we do with the film is the part that is action. So we will have three components, the first of which is education, which we are doing right now. So thank you, all of you, for being a part of that. This is important. Education is critical and at the center of taking action. The second part is creating awareness, which is about bringing the film out to a wider audience through conferences and events, universities, wherever it is that we can screen the film and then have a discussion with the audience and hopefully motivate them to do something. And the third part is advocacy. And for the advocacy part, we are working and collaborating with nonprofit organizations, both in Brazil and internationally, to help defend Indigenous land rights in Brazil, but also to empower the Indigenous leaders to be their own voices in conferences and perhaps one day even in Skype in the classroom and Skype sessions like this. I can only act as an amplifier or a megaphone. These are people that have a voice, and that voice needs a place to be heard. So we're hoping to be able to go in and do some training and some empowerment sessions and bring the Indigenous leaders out to conferences, to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And then eventually, hopefully in spring of next year, we may even be able to connect them to some of you. So this is the Tribes on the Edge project. It's quite a vast project. I'll just show you a couple of photographs. We'll take a little bit of a verbal break, and I'll show you a couple of images that were taken there, so you can get a little bit of an idea of who these people are. So I'm just going to do a very old-fashioned show and tell. This is a young girl from the Marubo tribe. There are 6 tribes in the Vale do Chiavari. I'm getting a question that I'm just going to answer quickly, and then we'll get back to this. How can students contribute in the process? So here's one very simple and important thing students can do is you tell your parents not to buy products that damage the jungle, the rainforest. So you need to look at what kind of wood you buy, avoid palm oil, lessen your consumption of beef or eliminate it, and lessen your consumption of soy. Because all of those things, so soy, beef, palm oil, and certain hardwoods, all contribute to deforestation. On that note, when we are done with our call, Laura will be sending out, and I'm not sure if it will go to each classroom, but it may go to Cone specifically, and then you can distribute. Laura will send you a list that we have put together so you can, the teachers and the students can talk further about what you can do. So I hope that answered your question. Will there be a video of this? That's going to be with question for Cone. Cone and I are recording. There you go. So back to this little girl. She's a young girl from the Marubo tribe. It's important to understand that in the Chiavari territory, there are 6 different contacted tribes and about 1,500 individuals that are uncontacted. That means they are from tribes that have never had contact with the outside world. And the contacted tribes say that this is part of their job is to protect the uncontacted people. So the Marubo tribe, they have been in contact over 80 years, so about 2 generations. There are, let me see, I have a few other photographs. This is an elder from the Matisse tribe. The Matisse tribe were contacted about 30 years ago. They're actually one of the more photographed tribes because of their, all of their markings. So National Geographic and BBC and Discovery have gone in and done more cultural kind of documentaries about the Matisse tribe. Now, what's important to understand is it's great to do those kinds of films, but it doesn't necessarily help protect them. So that is why they asked me to tell their story, not to follow them on a hunt or film their cultural ways, but to actually tell the story of the issues that they're facing. And then I took a step beyond that in taking the action part. The last photo I'll show you of an individual. This is a man named Adauto. He is from the Kulina tribe. Now, the Kulina tribe is actually the smallest tribe in the Vale do Javari in Brazil. But in his own words, he has hope that by uniting his communities, they will be able to survive. So he is one of the one of the hope messages of the film of Tribes on the Edge. Céline, what is the most difficult thing you have to do to cope with tribes? Well, first of all, we don't go into any of the villages that we are not invited to. So it's not so much difficult in dealing with the tribes themselves because we go where we were asked to or where we were invited. What is difficult, however, is more on a very personal note. I only get to go to each village for 3 to 4 days because there's the territory. Those of you who are in Portugal will understand this. Those of you who are in the United States will compare it to Maine. The Vale do Javari is the size of Maine or the size of Portugal. So it's 33,000 square miles or 85,000 square kilometers, and it's all jungle. So it's very difficult to access these tribes. So what's tough for me is only being able to spend 3 or 4 days in any one village so that I'm able to get as many participants in the film as possible. And that doesn't feel like a deep enough connection with any one tribe. But in order to be fair, I had to try to represent all of the different ethnicities. What's most difficult is the terrain and physically, because the distances are so vast. We did run out of fuel. We had to wait for a canoe to come with our reserve fuel. The bugs are difficult. The circumstances are difficult. More than anything, the stories are really hard to deal with. These are people who deserve to live just like the rest of us, and they are facing diseases that were brought in by outsiders. So on an emotional level, it's hard to hear all this. My students want to know if you're at home. I am at home. Yes, this is actually my office. I don't know how much of it you can see, but yeah, this is home. This is my home office. So when I am in New York State, which is I'm 2 hours north of New York City, this is where I work from. I have my art table over there because I also draw and design jewelry. So I try to get there as much as possible, but more often than not, I'm sitting at this computer doing emails. You don't see the pictures, Annika, I'm sorry about that. This is in line with my anthropology studies, fantastic. From your understanding of indigenous tribes, I'm reading questions. What can we adopt or adapt from indigenous tribes to make our cities sustainable? That's a great question from the 6th graders. You know, I think one of the biggest things is just this consciousness notion of living in balance and living sustainably. If you are living in a city, it's obviously you're not going to go out and hunt your food or cut a tree to make a canoe, but you can choose the food that you eat in terms of sustainability. You can choose the kind of transportation you take. You can choose to recycle as much as possible. Everything that they use is compostable. So one way that we can adapt it is to essentially use less items that are throwaway. Plastics is one of the biggest issues. So stay away from single-use plastic. Say no to single-use straws, cups, or anything like that. You can buy metal straws if you really want to sip out of a straw. I think all of those things are about adapting a consciousness to what it means to live in balance with nature. And it starts with single actions, and then it really will spread into your way of thinking, your way of being, and your life. Tell your parents, if you're students, ask your parents to only buy green or biodegradable products. Ask them not to use a plastic bag for every apple or pear that they take at the supermarket, but rather bring your own bags. Everything helps because it changes the way we think. So that's what I would say to all of you in terms of where you are in your cities. And as I said earlier, in terms of how we can help the tribes themselves, not decreasing or not eating beef, decreasing or not eating soy, palm oil, and then looking at where your wood comes from. Those are all really important because they affect the economy of a country and the development into territories. And again, you'll receive a, I believe it's a one-pager with some of the action plans that you can take in your classes. Is there any type of education there for the kids? Yes, actually. So the kids in the villages, they do have classes up to a certain age. They are government-appointed teachers that go into the Indigenous territory. Unfortunately, what that means is that the teacher is teaching in Portuguese and not in the native language, because each tribe has a different language. So the learning of the native language rests within the family. All the children will speak their native language as well as Portuguese if they go to school. But schooling stops at a certain age. And some of the children want to go into the bordering town or city to continue their education, which is perfectly normal. One of the projects that we are trying to bring into the Chiavari in terms of education comes out of Mexico. It's called Kaanbal, Kaanbal. It's actually like a portable intra-web system, and if we provide tablets that have Wi-Fi, they connect into this portable intraweb, and whatever information we load on that system, on the Kaanbal system, all of the tablets can access. So much like any of you would surf the web, but you would have a never-ending source of information, they can surf whatever information is put on the Kaanbal. So we're going to assess if that's something that they want. And if it is, it may mean that we expand their access to education within their villages without having electricity or access to the internet. What is the most important thing you learned from your grandfather? One of the, wow, my grandfather was one of many people in my family who traveled. And one of the greatest lessons was our interconnection with everything on the planet. I know that sounds really big, but he explored so many different places and made connections with species and ecosystems and cultures and people, that what I saw was that we are connected to everything. That even if we're different, we're similar. And even if we're similar, we may be the same. And what I've taken from that is this idea that the human species is completely interconnected, and what happens to some of us happens to all of us. But my mother was also on expeditions. She, for 13 years, was an expedition photographer with my grandfather. And that taught me that women can do this kind of work, that they can go out into the field and be explorers and adventurers and filmmakers and storytellers, scientists, photographers. So I owe a lot to her. My grandmother as well, she was on the Calypso and in expeditions more than any of my family members. But she was behind the scenes and behind camera. And on that level, I think that it also taught me that you can be a silent supporter of something and still have tremendous impact. You don't always need to be the person who's the known person. My grandfather was what all of you knew because he was in front of cameras and he was the famous one. But it took his entire team to make that happen. No person does it alone. And that's the same for me. It's the same for anybody that you know about or see. They have a team of people to enable that. So it's important to remember that you're not alone and you shouldn't try to do it alone. Climate change, Indigenous issues, human rights, environmental protection, it's going to take all of us. And each one of us has a role to play. How do I communicate with the tribes? So mostly I understand Portuguese. I speak Spanish, and their Portuguese is basic enough that I can understand it. However, we always have a translator with us. So we have somebody from one of the tribes who's able to translate the tribal language into Portuguese. And I always have somebody with me who is either an anthropologist or a field producer who speaks several languages. So it's not always easy, but you do a lot of hand gestures too, and you figure it out. For the interviews, we need proper translations, so that's why we have the translators. Lakewood students would love to know what has been your most favorite place to visit to date. Wow, it's a tough, the favorite question is always hard. I loved I mean, I love going to the Amazon. It's always difficult and intense. It's not like a vacation at all. It's really hard, but it's my heart place. So I have to say it's one of my favorite places. Hawaii was actually magical because we were filming humpback whales. So it's more of Hawaii underwater with whales. That is one of my favorite places. And where else? I have to say Antarctica was a surprise. I don't like the cold. And I had to go to Antarctica to film part of a series for Chilean television. And it was completely magical, and it was a wonderful surprise. So my recommendation there is, no matter how close or how far a place is, even if you think you don't want to go, just try, because you might discover something there that you actually really like. How did I first connect with the tribes of the Chiavari? So in 2007, I went with my father and my brother. We were doing a documentary for PBS called Return to the Amazon. And we were going back to places my grandfather had been to in the early 1980s. One of those places was the Vale do Javari. When my grandfather was in the Chiavari in the early 80s, the Métis tribe had come into contact about 3 years earlier. So he was going in to film with the Métis tribe. So we went back in 2006 and 7, but in 2007, we went back to the Chiavari as one of many places in the Amazon to see what had changed. And it was at that time that I first met the tribes, so 2007. In 2010, I got an email because, yes, they leave their indigenous territory. There's a border town, and they sometimes get online. And I got an email from somebody, one of the Marubo leaders, asking me to tell their story. So that's how I got to Tribes on the Edge. Let me see. I have a student, Tammy, wants to know when you got involved with the Tribes Project. So there you go. That's kind of the answer to that. Have you ever taken part in expeditions with your dad? Hello, Ukraine. Hello, Poland. I have, actually. So my father did a series called Ocean Adventures in 2006 and 7 for a US television station called PBS. And we were able to do a whole series of documentaries together. We filmed the gray whale migration from Baja, California up to Barrow, Alaska. We filmed the marine protected areas of North America. Film Return to the Amazon was part of that project as well. So we did quite a few episodes together. Greetings from Pakistan. Hi from the US. It starts with single actions. Yes, indeed. Let me see. I'm going to keep going down. A list of products and action plans that you mentioned. Yeah, you'll be getting a handout, which are some of those actions. So somebody will get that to you. I'm sure, Cone, I'm putting you responsible for it since you're the organizer. So you'll be getting that in hand and won't have to just commit it to memory. Please share recording of the talk. We're living in a village where grandparents still have indigenous knowledge about most of the things that are happening in the past. They always say seasons have lost their meaning. I think that that's really important. So what you're pointing to here is something that I firmly believe in, that we really need to listen to our elders. We have lost that in a lot of cultures, but our elders have seen things that we haven't, and they've witnessed changes that we can learn from. But more importantly, they can pass on a cultural heritage that connects us. And that brings me to something I feel is missing in our societies or has started to fall apart, and that's that notion of community. So your community can be your family, it can be your friends, it can be your village, it can be greater than that. It can be these online platforms connecting to students and teachers everywhere. And I think that reconnection is really important. So make sure you keep connected to your community and look around your area to see how it is that you can help people around you. How does global, this is from Suad, a question from Charles, would like to know how global warming affects the tribes. What I have heard, and probably the only thing that has been transmitted directly to me, was that the rains have completely changed. So they very much live by the rhythm of the seasons. But when we're trying to plan our expeditions, we know when we go according to seasons. And what they've said to us is that usually we would have told you to come always in June. Now we don't know because the rain comes at different times. So that's a result of climate change. The other thing that they have seen, believe it or not, is a drought. And this was several years ago. There was a pretty bad drought in the Amazon, which for a rainforest is really not natural. And that's a result of climate change. Any possibility of preserving indigenous tribes? I really hope so. Preserving indigenous tribes is about protecting their rights to their indigenous land. So, once more, going back to the beginning of the session, if we protect their land rights, their rights to actually live on their ancestral territory, they are the best guardians of the ecosystem. So when we think about the environment, if you want to protect the environment, protecting tribes and their rights would be a great way forward. Carson would like to know if you ever had a close encounter with a shark while diving. Yes, Carson, I have. I actually did a documentary for Discovery Channel called Mysteries of the Shark Coast. And we were working with 6 different scientists in Australia with 6 different shark species. And on a lot of them, we were catching the sharks, tagging them, and then releasing them in the water so we could track where their territories were. The tags allowed us to track how deep they dive and when they come up. It gave us temperature, a body temperature, so we could try to see when their body temperature rises and is that correlated with going to deeper water, which means they might be trying to lower their body temperature. And it allowed us to see how far the sharks go so that if we propose ideas for protecting the species, it's about protecting their territory and not just the animal itself. So that's one shark encounter. What do they do to sustain their livelihood? Really good question. So they basically live off the land. That's kind of the basis of it. As one person has said, the forest is their supermarket. So all of their food comes from the forest, whether they're hunting for meat or fishing or agriculture. They now have contact with the outside world. So they do go into the town, which sometimes takes 10 days to travel to. And they will buy things like rice and bread. Sadly, they buy candy as well. They've discovered sugar. So they'll go into the neighboring town and buy things from there. The way they get money is they get a government subsidy. So Brazil provides a government subsidy to people under the poverty line, but they have to physically go into the bank with their thumbprint, because they don't write, with their thumbprint to collect their money. So you can imagine that people who live 10 days away aren't going to travel once a month to go do that. So it's subsistence living. It's the basics, making sure that they are fed, that they have proper shelter, that their children are healthy, and now they have education, which is fantastic. It's a dangerous trip. Can you tell us about one of the most dangerous situations I faced? Probably one of the more dangerous ones was while I was diving, and it had to do with currents in the water. It was not people, and it was not sharks. It wasn't animals. It was the currents in the water were so strong that we had to hang on to a rope to get down to the bottom. And I was running out of breath as I was going down because it was so difficult. So I decided to stop. I went back to the boat and I put my equipment down on the boat. And it was really a tough decision to make because we are taught to succeed. We are taught that we have a goal, and if you don't reach that goal, you fail. And in that moment, I felt like I had failed because the rest of my team had gone down and they were stronger divers than I was. But it was one of the best lessons of my life, because what I was calling failure was actually me making sure I stayed alive. And that's success. So be careful about what you think is a success or a failure. It was the smartest decision I could make, because not only did I keep myself safe, but I kept the rest of my team members safe. because if I had been in trouble down there, I would have put them in danger as well. So that was probably one of the scariest situations I faced. Preparing the actions, fantastic. We were hit hard by Hurricane Sandy. Are the tribes experiencing catastrophic weather events? So not as violent as a hurricane, but again, having the rain patterns constantly changing, it makes it difficult because they 100% depend on the seasons in order to know when to plant and harvest. And if they don't plant and harvest, they can't just run to the supermarket and get additional food. So the changes in climate and the changes in rain pattern for them are detrimental. Could Kanbal internet be applied in other remote communities? Yes. So they have just started this Kanbal education unit in Mexico. And I believe that they've only implemented it in the Mayan communities. But with our project, if we can find the money to bring them to Brazil, they will start extending the program in other places. So absolutely, as long as they can essentially recharge, even with solar panels, recharge the Kanbal unit, they'll be able to use it. I'm going to have to jump down to because there's so many questions I can't keep up. Robin would love to know if you have ever seen a manta ray while diving. Yes, Robin, and yes, they are as majestic as they seem. You can't see my arms, they're massive creatures, and they're so elegant when they swim through the water. It is really magical. We were filming, so I have a privilege in that I get access to a lot of places because we are filming, so we have permits, and we work with scientists who are specialists in either the ecosystem or the species we're working with. And when we were in Hawaii, we were filming manta rays at night. So anybody who's a diver or aspires to be can do this dive. But literally they were flying right above our heads and just skimming the top of our heads as they were flying by. They're beautiful, peaceful, absolutely spectacular creatures. Adnan wants to know how you learned so much about the tribes. I didn't study. I actually just went and worked with them. So my knowledge of everything I'm talking about is from experience being in the field. I'm not a scientist. I didn't study science. I actually studied psychology. My graduate degree was intercultural relations, which helps me work between cultures, not just in terms of spoken language, but understanding body language. And that helps me, I think, connect with the tribes. And then just being very open and sensitive. I asked Beto, the person who asked me to tell this story, I asked him, why me? Why did you choose me to tell your story? And he said, because you have a sensitivity that I had not seen in others. And I think that's something very important. When you walk in somewhere, if you have the intention to be open and to understand what is being said to you with no judgment, and if you have the intention to actually help, it's felt and it is known. So that's it. It was just that. Kareem wants to know a tough question. Kareem wants to know if I've ever witnessed an animal slaughter. I haven't witnessed anything as brutal as what you may have seen happen in Japan with the dolphins or in the north of Alaska with the baby seals, but I have witnessed animals being slain for food, whether it's a cow or a turtle. But all of it is used, and it's not in mass quantities. Again, I mean, I've seen it in small villages. So it's not as brutal as what you might see in documentaries with mass quantities. And it's subsistence. It's really, they only kill what they need to eat. So on that level, it's been very humane. What an amazing experience. Thank you, Tammy. Obrigada para você. I'm assuming you're in Portugal. The greatest threat to the tribes, I'm going to answer 2 or 3 more questions and then we'll wrap it up. The greatest threat that the indigenous tribes face today. On a bigger level, it's our lack of empathy. If people don't know what's happening, then we need to help educate them. But if we don't do anything about it, that lack of empathy is the biggest threat. because we think that it's them and they're over there and we're over here. So why does it matter? It matters. It's a human being. It's a human life. And as I've said before, Indigenous tribes are the frontline guardians of our ecosystems. Their presence actually helps us breathe. Because the Amazon provides 20% of our oxygen, you have to imagine that the more indigenous land there is, the more that forest has a chance of remaining standing. So if we can move from just caring to doing, that will be very helpful. On a very concrete basis, the tribes I'm working with are facing with 80% rates of hepatitis. So they have hepatitis A, B, C, and Delta, which is a preventable disease, but the problem is that the access to vaccinations is very difficult, and the government health organization isn't doing enough. So the immediate threat is their health status. The next threat is the rights to their land. The government wants to change those rights. And then the overall threat is our lack of action. So climate action. My favorite, Declan would like to know what my favorite memory from all my trips. I can't do just one. I'm going to have to do several. A lot of my favorite memories are back in the Amazon, just working with people and honestly being humbled by them. That when I think I know something, I learn something else. And that has been a lot coming from Indigenous leaders who have just very simply said things that have motivated me to do more. So one example, when I went to the Peruvian Amazon in 2006, I was asking one Indigenous leader if we could take our team to film their stories. And he said, "What are your stories going to do to help us?" And I said, "Wow, well, I think that the world is going to see what's happening." This was the Peruvian Amazon with your tribes, and they're going to care. And his message back said, "That's very nice of you to think. But doctors come here and they study our plants, and we see no results to help our people. And they make the little white pills that you take in your Western world. Anthropologists come into our villages, and they study our people, and we give them our stories. They say they're going to help, but they go back to their countries and write their papers, and we see nothing." He says, "So it's very kind of you to think that your stories will help, but it's not enough." And it's a very hard lesson to learn, that even though our intention is great, it's not enough, but it's a very good lesson to take, that there is always something more we can do. And sometimes it means just asking that person exactly what they need. And in this case, I did. I said, "Okay, what can I do for you?" Directly. He said, "We need camcorders. We need little cameras, because our trackers, the people in our villages that are going across our land, they are wanting to film the contamination from oil companies, and we need cameras." And I would have never known that had I not asked. So it's one of my favorite stories, one of my favorite encounters, because of that, because it was a moment of a very tough lesson, but also of growing. And we all need to grow. It doesn't matter how young or old we are. Best regards from Indonesia. Thank you to you too. I'm going down. I'm going to have to skip some. Hello from Sri Lanka. Sweden. My goodness, this is fantastic. I've got to develop skill. Yes. I think everybody can read all of these. Thank you all for all of these fantastic comments. This has really been lovely. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, and I kind of feel like I need to, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do a little screen grab of some of you here, and I'm going to stick you on my Twitter. Thank you all for being here, for doing the work that you do. I wish I could hear all of your voices. Cone, I don't know if we're supposed to do it, but I don't mind if everybody unmutes and we just shout out a big goodbye, because this has just been lovely. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you, everyone, whatever country or time zone you're in, thank you for being there.
It was great.
Thank you.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye. Bye.
It's not bad. Give a tap to your shoulder.
Thank you.
Very nice.
All right. Oh, look, he's wearing a Harvard sweatshirt, guys.
Oh, I saw a Patriots shirt.
There you go.
Where's Queen? Can't hear Queen.
Okay, Celine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your inspiring story, mission, and thoughts. So sorry for the noise while you were presenting, and it was really an honor to have you on this call, and we wish you all the very best. I'll definitely share the lists Laura will send, and also thank you to all the teachers and students who attended this call. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, wait.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Devil the haters.
Yeah, there's the Patriots. There.
Oh.
Turn.
Oh, boy.
I think that might be Massachusetts.
He's talking about Massachusetts.
Stay